Mongolian horse archers conquered half of the known world. In a single serious siege, they would easily unleash tens of millions of arrows at the enemy. And yet, they never complained about empty quivers. One might ask, how is this possible when in their native steppe there is nothing but grass and wind? Where did the guys on horseback get ammunition in such industrial quantities? And the answer actually breaks all the usual stereotypes about medieval wars. Hello everyone, you're on the Amazing History channel, and today's episode is dedicated to the most discussed topic in our comments. As always, we express our gratitude to our regular viewers and sponsors for their support. I won't keep you waiting, let's get started. At first glance, a Mongolian arrow might seem unimpressive. A wooden stick less than a meter long and weighing about 50 grams. But in reality, it's a highly precise instrument, and making this thing required advanced technology. Let's take the shaft. If it's even slightly crooked, the arrow will miss the target. If it's too heavy, it'll drop quickly, and if it's too light, it won't pierce armor. If you use raw wood, in the cold or heat, it'll just twist like a propeller. That's why the Mongols used birch, poplar, or willow from river valleys, where the wood has straight, dense fibers. The wood was dried for a long time and carefully processed. The standard length of a combat shaft is from 80 to 100 centimeters and 8 millimeters in diameter. Next are the arrowheads, which came in various types depending on their purpose. If it was necessary to pierce chainmail, they used narrow, faceted, armor-piercing tips that spread the rings apart and didn't get stuck in the armor. Against infantry without armor, they used broad cutting heads, flat cutters that left terrible wounds. And for wooden fortifications, they struck with heavy, solid, blunt heads. A separate masterpiece was the whistling arrows. A hollow bone attachment was fixed behind the arrowhead. In flight, it emitted a nasty screech at a frequency from 500 to 1000 Hz. That kind of sound makes the human brain panic before it even realizes what's happening. Now the fletching. 3 feathers set at a precise angle to stabilize the flight. They used eagle, goose, or crane feathers. And it's not about aesthetics at all, because a stiff feather gives perfect stability but slows down the arrow. A soft feather works the opposite way. That's why choosing the right feather for a specific arrowhead was a science in itself. And finally, all of this had to be glued together somehow. The glue was made from fish or bone gelatin mixed with resin. A cheap substitute would crack when hitting a shield or crumble in the cold. That's why the Mongolian mixture held the arrowhead firmly in place even after piercing wooden gates. It turns out that behind a single shot stood a metallurgist, a carpenter, a hunter, a leather worker who stitched the quiver, and a glue maker. And now multiply this production chain by the needs of an army that conquered half the world. And the question of where they got their weapons in the bare steppe becomes the main military mystery of the 13th century. People often picture the Mongolian steppe as a flat, grassy plain stretching for thousands of kilometers without a single branch, but the reality is very different. Willows, poplars, and birches grew quite well along the river valleys. Just a bit further north, the taiga began, and there was plenty of reed by the water bodies. Any nomad knew their value. A good straight rod was something he understood better than a modern city dweller understands exchange rates. The problem was something else. One grove was enough to arm a small squad for a local skirmish with neighbors. But when we're talking about an imperial war, local resources, of course, weren't enough. At such a scale, it's not the presence of bushes by the river that matters, but uninterrupted logistics, and in the steppe, there simply wasn't any. Now let's do the math. A rider carries 2 or 3 quivers, which is about 60 arrows. In the heat of battle, projectiles break against shields, sink into the mud, and get stuck deep in bodies. Even if you shoot very sparingly, one tumen, which is 10,000 warriors, burns through hundreds of thousands of arrows in a major battle. And it's best to refill the quivers by the next morning, not a month later when the supply train arrives. Before Genghis Khan, the steppe economy covered its shortages through 3 methods. This was classic barter. We give you horses and hides, you give us metal and wood. This is outright racketeering, when a strong tribe simply extorted tribute from weaker neighbors. And of course, good old-fashioned robbery. It's a quick method, but in the long run it's a dead end, because a destroyed city doesn't produce anything anymore. The genius of Genghis Khan was that he took these three separate methods and combined them into a tough corporate machine. Next. Genghis Khan introduced a regular tax with clear regulations. Trade became compulsory if someone refused to sell willingly. And spontaneous looting was replaced by planned confiscation of resources with their immediate processing right on the spot. And for this machine to work, it was necessary to constantly seize new territories. Ammunition was used up much faster than people were dying, and stopping the expansion was impossible not so much because of geopolitical ambitions, but for purely industrial reasons. Without the influx of fresh resources, the empire's military assembly line would simply grind to a halt. There really was iron in the Mongolian steppe, it's just that the metal wasn't lying right underfoot. The deposits of Altai and Khubsugul were being developed long before Genghis Khan. According to some geologists' estimates, just at the ancient workings near Lake Khubsugul, 250,000 cubic meters of rock were removed. Even with primitive smelting, this yielded about 15,000 tons of pure iron. Considering that one arrowhead weighs about 15 grams, the reserves were enough for an astronomical number of shots. So there was no problem with the raw material itself. The problem was with access, and the Mongols solved it through ruthless conquest. By 1207, the eldest son of Genghis Khan, Jochi, came to the Yenisei Kyrgyz and other forest tribes who lived on rich deposits. The local chiefs looked at his army, realistically assessed their chances, and decided not to resist. They bought him off with white gerfalcons and sables. But the empire needed more than just prestigious furs. The conquered peoples were immediately forced to pay tribute in iron and finished weapons. That was enough to start with, but appetites grew, and for a continental war, there were far too few Siberian blacksmiths. And that's when the Mongols found a simple solution. When invading a state with advanced metallurgy like the Tangut state or even Khwarezm, they acted like a ruthless machine. After storming a city, the military and the elite were usually put to the sword to prevent any uprisings. But blacksmiths, armorers, smelters, and engineers were singled out from the crowd and protected like the apple of their eye. Such specialists were valued more than gold, so they were relocated by the thousands deep into the empire, creating real industrial hubs. Specialized production centers sprang up right in the steppe. For example, the city of Chinkai, Bolgasun. By the middle of the 13th century, the empire had grown so much that ammunition for it was being produced simultaneously in China, Persia, Central Asia, and the steppe itself. Here was a problem historians rarely discuss in military history textbooks. Arrows from different regions behaved completely differently. A southern craftsman could forge a heavier arrowhead, while a northern one could carve a thicker shaft. As a result, a rider receives a fresh quiver from an unfamiliar city, draws the bowstring, and the arrow either doesn't fit on it at all or flies in a completely unpredictable trajectory. Something had to be done about this, and in the second half of the 13th century, especially with the rise to power of Kublai Khan, the empire adopted standards. Now craftsmen are required to copy the weight, length, and thickness exactly. And to motivate the manufacturers, the Mongols introduced a quality control system for military products. Batches of weapons were stamped with the marks of both the craftsmen themselves and the inspecting officials. And if a defective batch was discovered at the front, the mark made it possible to find the person responsible. By the way, European armies would only achieve interchangeable calibers and standardization of ammunition in the 19th century. But making millions of arrows is only half the job. Delivering them over thousands of kilometers directly to the front line is an entirely different challenge. And the Mongols solved it by creating what today would be called a global distribution logistics network. The main tool was the famous YAM relay system. Initially, this transcontinental network of stations, placed a day's journey apart from each other, was built for couriers and the delivery of urgent orders. But the Mongols quickly realized that the infrastructure, which was perfect for moving information, was also great for supplying goods. The Mongol postal stations began to be surrounded by barns and warehouses. The cavalry moved quickly, but heavy wagons moved slowly. If the vanguard urgently needed to replenish their ammunition, the quartermasters didn't wait for a supply convoy from the capital, but took reserves from the nearest transshipment point. At the same time, specialized supply convoys with ammunition always followed behind the advancing tumans. Each rider had his own personal supply in his quivers. A mobile reserve in wagons follows behind. Further back are the depots at the postal stations, and in the rear, factories are ready to fulfill urgent orders. And by the middle of the 13th century, this logistical machine was working so routinely and reliably that chroniclers simply stopped paying attention to it. As the empire expanded, building new arms factories in every conquered region became too time-consuming and expensive, and so the Mongols simply imposed a weapons tax on the conquered peoples. Tribute had to be paid not only in silver, silk, or grain. Cities were also required to deliver finished arrows in huge batches, and no one really cared whether local elder would get the iron or wood. The quota had to be met at any cost. Excuses like "we don't have the raw materials" were not accepted. For failing to deliver, imperial tax collectors could easily execute the administrators or wipe out an entire district, simply as a warning to others. The Mongols were just as efficient with materials. Why haul wood for making arrows from thousands of kilometers away when the material is literally smoldering under your feet? Everything was used: enemy siege engines, debris from wooden fortifications, destroyed houses, abandoned carts. All of it was instantly recycled. The wood was immediately cut up and used for arrow shafts. There was another detail that does credit to the Mongol war machine. After storming cities, the supply teams would spread out through the ruins and thoroughly comb the area. They would pull arrows out of logs, corpses, and burned wagons. All of this was carefully sorted. Intact arrows were immediately returned to the quivers and loaded onto the supply wagons. If the shaft was broken, the arrowhead still wasn't thrown away. It was collected in a separate pile. Right there on the ashes, improvised field forges were set up where bent or broken iron was hastily melted down and reforged. By the way, according to the observations of the traveler Plano Carpini, the warriors had files attached directly to their quivers. You shoot, find the arrow, sharpen the dull tip, and use it again. That's exactly why modern archaeologists find so little iron at the sites of major Mongol battles. According to accounts by contemporaries, the arrows flew like a heavy rain, and after the barrage, wooden palisades looked like the bristles on a boar's back. You would think the ground would be strewn with metal, but it's not. That's because the victor took everything with him. So, the answer to the main question of this episode turned out to be extremely pragmatic. The nomads didn't try to find millions of arrows in the bare steppe. They made half of Eurasia work for them. The Siberian mines provided iron, the river valleys gave perfect wood, trade routes supplied glue and resin, and the conquered cities gave up their best engineers and craftsmen. The yam stations connected all of this into a single logistical network. And fear made this machine work without a single failure. There is a particular historical irony in how exactly this era came to an end. The system that conquered half the world with arrows began to fade not under enemy blows and not from a lack of resources. It simply became obsolete. The era of gunpowder arrived and traditional bows and arrows began to fade into the past for good. Well, that's all from me. Thank you so much for watching the episode until the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos, and see you soon.